It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
A 40-mile walk in the freezing rain might clear your head, a leaner, and maybe it will finally teach you some absolute gratitude for the life I provide. That was the text message my husband of 34 years sent to me from the warmth of his heated luxury SUV. He had just locked the heavy iron deadbolt of our remote mountain cabin, leaving me standing on the cracked wooden porch, holding nothing but my small leather purse. The air was a biting 28 degrees, the kind of wet northwest cold that seeps directly into the bone and paralyses your breath. I stood in total silence, watching his red taillights disappear down the winding dirt road, quickly swallowed by the dense, towering pine forest. He thought he was teaching me a powerful lesson about obedience and absolute power. He honestly believed he had left me completely broken, stranded, and terrified in the impending storm. He had no idea that I was already pressing the send button on my hidden secondary phone, initiating a sequence of events that would systematically dismantle his entire life. To anyone else, being abandoned in the freezing rain by the man who vowed to protect them would have been a moment of soul-crushing despair. But for me, it simply marked the end of an agonizing 8-month investigation. I didn't shed a single tear as the first drops of icy rain hit the porch roof. Instead, my thumb traced the smooth, cold surface of the backup phone hidden deep in my coat pocket. The storm was rolling violently over the mountain, shaking the ancient pines, but I was the one bringing the real lightning. What Richard was about to discover would shake the foundation of his existence. From the outside looking in, Richard Vance was the absolute pinnacle of Seattle real estate success and patriarchal stability. He was tall, impeccably tailored, and possessed a charismatic, commanding smile that could effortlessly disarm hostile city council members and ruthless developers alike. At charity galas and exclusive country club dinners, he would tightly wrap his heavy arm around my waist, proudly introducing me as the brilliant engine that kept his home fires burning. He played the exact part of the devoted, protective patriarch with a terrifying, calculated perfection. But once the heavy oak doors of our Mercer Island estate clicked securely shut, the grand performance ended abruptly. In the quiet, stifling isolation of our home, Richard believed that love was completely synonymous with absolute obedience. He viewed our marriage not as an equal partnership, but as a corporate acquisition where he was the unchallengeable majority shareholder. If you are listening to this story right now, let me know exactly where you are tuning in from. Drop your city or state in the comments below, so I know I am not speaking entirely into the void. I need to tell you exactly how I got here. How a 64-year-old woman who spent 20 years hunting down hidden municipal funds ended up standing on a freezing porch in the dead of winter. The truth is, people ask me if I regret what I did to him. They ask if destroying his massive real estate empire and burning his legacy to ash was too harsh a penalty for a crumbling marriage. Here is what I tell them without hesitation. I did not destroy Richard Vance. I simply held up a spotless mirror, heavily documented his reflection, and let the indifferent legal system calculate the catastrophic cost of his own cruelty. I didn't scream, I didn't break fine china, and I certainly didn't beg for my life back. I used the exact weapons he arrogantly handed me to forge my freedom. The severe imbalance in our marriage had grown incredibly slowly, creeping into our lives like toxic black mold hidden behind expensive drywall. It tasted exactly like small, seemingly logical compromises at first. When I was pregnant with our first daughter, he casually suggested I take a temporary leave from my demanding career as a senior municipal auditor. Why stress yourself with balancing city budgets when my portfolio is taking off so beautifully? He had reasoned, his voice incredibly smooth and persuasive. Let me carry the heavy financial burden, a leaner. I had agreed, genuinely believing it was an act of profound, selfless care. But that temporary leave slowly dissolved into a permanent, suffocating expectation. I went from auditing multi-million-dollar city contracts to managing his dry cleaning schedule, slowly fading into the background of his rising star. Soon enough, he completely shifted our joint checking accounts to a private banking tier that required a dual authentication app hosted exclusively on his personal phone. If I needed to buy weekly groceries, hire a local plumber, or purchase a simple birthday gift for our daughter, I had to formally request the funds. He proudly called it optimizing our household cash flow. I foolishly told myself it was just his analytical business mind at work, willfully ignoring the fast-tightening collar around my very neck. At sophisticated dinner parties, he would silence my opinions with a sharp, freezing look if I ever dared to contradict his political or economic views. I became progressively smaller, significantly quieter, until I almost started to believe his drastically diminished version of me. The independent woman I used to be was buried alive. Let me take you back to a completely ordinary Tuesday morning, exactly 10 months before the mountain cabin incident. I was standing in our vast kitchen, frantically searching the cold granite countertops for my heavy car keys. I knew without a shadow of a doubt I had placed them by the espresso machine, right next to the floral ceramic bowl my daughter had painted for me in the 3rd grade. It was an object I cherished heavily, an anchor in my daily routine. But the bowl was completely empty. Richard walked in, casually buttoning his crisp Italian cuffs, his face wearing an impenetrable mask of mild concern. "Looking for these, Alina?" he asked smoothly, cheerfully dangling my keys from his index finger. He claimed he had found them resting in the upstairs guest bathroom, a room I hadn't entered in days. I stared at him, my heart doing a strange, fluttering stumble in my chest as a cold wave of confusion washed over me. I hadn't been in that guest bathroom for over 3 days. "I didn't put them there, Richard," I stated smoothly, forcing my voice to remain perfectly calm despite the panic. He just sighed deeply, giving me a painfully patronizing smile that made me feel incredibly small. "Alina, you really need to be more careful. Your memory is becoming a significant liability to this household." That seemingly trivial moment was the beginning of his most terrifying, calculated campaign, the systematic dismantling of my own reality. He had smoothly planted the deadly seed of dementia, and he intended to water it daily until it consumed my entire life. The psychological escalation continued mercilessly over the next 3 grueling months. He started maliciously moving my grandmother's antique gardening tools from the wooden shed, casually dropping them into the trunk of my car a week later. Leather bookmarks in the suspense novels I was reading would miraculously jump back 50 pages overnight. When I nervously pointed out the bizarre discrepancies, Richard would look at me with deeply manufactured, performative pity. He would slowly pour me a glass of filtered water, deliberately placing a gentle, heavy hand on my trembling shoulder. "You've been under an immense amount of stress lately, my dear," he would murmur, speaking just loud enough for our dedicated housekeeper to hear. "We all misplace things as we age. It's perfectly natural to experience a little cognitive slip." He was burying me alive with kindness. We were formally hosting a dinner party for his newest corporate investors, a massive dining table glittering with expensive crystal and $70 steaks. The conversation inevitably turned to the city's complicated new zoning laws. I chimed in happily, confidently mentioning a specific loophole in the municipal code I had audited 15 years ago. Before my sentence was finished, Richard reached completely across the table and placed his heavy hand firmly over mine. The gesture looked loving to others, but his grip was like an absolute vice, painfully grinding my gold wedding band into my knuckle. "Alina, sweetheart, that zoning law was totally repealed months ago," he laughed dismissively, locking eyes with the silent, uncomfortable guests. "But we surely appreciate the history lesson. My beautiful wife has always lived intensely in the past." He had perfectly rewritten reality right in front of them, maliciously turning my sharp professional expertise into a glaring symptom of cognitive decline. The wealthy guests looked at me not with absolute respect, but with profound, uncomfortable pity. That was the tragic moment I completely stopped trying to argue with him. When you stop fighting back, the controlling person immediately assumes they have unequivocally won. They fatally assume your total silence is absolute submission. What Richard didn't realize in his bottomless arrogance was that my silence was actually the beginning of a relentless, uncompromising audit. I wasn't retreating into the shadows out of fear. I was stepping into the shadows because it offered the perfect vantage point to observe his crimes. 2 weeks after that devastating dinner party, I decided to finally test my own sanity against his insidious gaslighting. I placed my brass reading glasses exactly 2 inches from the far corner of my mahogany bedside table, the beautiful desk my late father had built by hand. I then discreetly marked the polished wood with a microscopic speck of clear nail polish. When I returned from the bustling grocery store 3 hours later, the heavy brass frames were inexplicably on the carpet under the bed. The tiny nail polish mark remained completely untouched. I hadn't bumped the large table. I hadn't been incredibly careless. Richard had purposefully moved them to make me doubt my mind. I sat down heavily, absolute clarity washing over my frozen body. I wasn't going crazy. I was being actively, aggressively managed. If a powerful man like Richard Vance was taking the extensive time to slowly convince the world that his loyal wife was losing her mind, he was building up to something far more sinister than petty domestic control. He was meticulously preparing to remove me, completely and permanently. But he had forgotten one incredibly crucial, dangerous detail in his grand scheme. He forgot that I was a senior financial auditor. And auditors absolutely do not operate on vague assumptions or raw feelings. We operate on flawless, undeniable, bulletproof documentation. What I didn't do, and this is what terrified him most later, was confront him immediately. I needed him to absolutely believe his master plan was working flawlessly. The deeper he dug my inevitable grave, the more evidence he left casually scattered behind. The true, horrifying depth of his deceit was about to reveal itself, and it started with a single, carelessly misplaced line item in our annual tax ledger. I broke his cardinal rule and logged into his unsecured home office computer while he was out playing 18 holes of golf. Deep within a folder misleadingly labeled Home Maintenance, I found a heavily encrypted spreadsheet listing a massive, unauthorized transfer of $45,000. It was aggressively routed to an LLC, ominously named Arya Holdings. He had no idea I still sharply remembered exactly how to trace money through layered corporate shells. I spent 2 solid decades relentlessly tracking down missing municipal funds and prosecuting corrupt contractors. Did he honestly think I couldn't trace a single, sloppy bank transfer back to its exact origin? I didn't immediately confront him about Arya Holdings. Confrontation without absolute leverage is just an invitation for more gaslighting. Instead, I carefully reached out to the only 2 people on this earth I trusted completely with my life. My brilliant nephew David, a high-level corporate IT security specialist, was my first urgent call. Under the entirely plausible guise of wanting to significantly upgrade the estate's aging wireless internet network, while Richard was away on a business trip, David spent an entire weekend wiring our home. He didn't just install new powerful routers. He surgically embedded high-definition micro-cameras in the home office, the expansive living room, and the heavy hallway safe. Every single video feed instantly backed up to a secure, remote server that Richard couldn't trace or destroy. My second discreet call was to Patricia Caldwell, a ruthlessly effective family law attorney who practically specialized in dismantling narcissistic men who weaponized their immense wealth against their spouses. Patricia was notoriously terrifying in a courtroom, a woman who treated divorce not as a negotiation, but as a total financial autopsy. She carefully instructed me to keep compiling documents, to never show a single ounce of anger, and to prepare for an overwhelming emergency filing the absolute moment we had enough irrefutable proof. I began carrying a $30 digital dictaphone taped securely inside my bra, capturing every demeaning comment, every twisted threat, and every instance of his relentless memory manipulation. My fear had completely evaporated, violently replaced by cold, calculating purpose. While digging aggressively through the bottom drawer of his locked filing cabinet, I finally found the devastating missing pieces of his grand puzzle. Buried beneath old property tax receipts was a heavily notarized quitclaim deed, actively transferring my legal ownership of the Mercer Island house directly into Aria Holdings. Worse, tucked neatly inside the crisp legal envelope was a heavily glossed brochure for Whispering Pines Memory Care Facility. A cold, absolute dread temporarily paralyzed my lungs. It all made perfect, horrifying sense. He wasn't simply preparing to divorce me and leave me with a fraction of his wealth. He was meticulously laying the legal groundwork to have me forcefully declared mentally incompetent, institutionalizing me so he could legally seize absolute control of my family trust. The shock of that discovery could have broken me, but strangely, it forged my spine into absolute steel. I quietly slipped the glossy dementia brochure back exactly where I found it, making sure it aligned perfectly with the dust ring in the heavy drawer. I carefully photographed the forged quitclaim deed with my secret secondary phone, instantly sending the encrypted image directly to Patricia's secure email server. Richard Vance thought he was playing a brilliant, high-stakes game of chess against a completely defenseless, aging woman. What he failed to realize was that I had already completely rewritten the rules, replaced the entire board, and quietly captured his king. All that remained was allowing him to confidently walk directly into the devastating trap I had set. With David's hidden cameras running silently 24 hours a day, the suffocating reality of Richard's secret life flooded into absolute view. Just a week later, while I was supposedly attending a charity luncheon, my tablet chimed with a secure motion alert from the home office. I watched in cold, completely detached silence as Richard ushered a stunningly young woman with bright blonde hair into our home. She was no older than 30, carrying an expensive designer handbag that I instantly recognized. It was the exact $5,000 bag Richard had claimed was currently out of stock when I asked for it for my last birthday. He casually poured her a costly glass of my favorite vintage wine, laughing loudly as she admired the expansive waterfront view. The audio feed from the hidden camera crackled sharply to life in my headset. "Don't get too attached to this specific house, Chloe," Richard confidently boasted, smoothly pulling her into a tight embrace. "Once the doctors officially sign off on Aliner's rapid cognitive decline, the conservatorship kicks in completely. I'll have total signature authority over the massive family trust within 6 months. We'll sell this outdated museum and build the modern glass compound in Bellevue." Chloe giggled softly, casually tracing the sharp lapel of his expensive suit jacket. "Are you absolutely sure she won't fight back, Richard? She used to be so incredibly sharp." Richard threw his head back and laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that made my deeply chilled blood run completely freezing cold. "Aliner doesn't even know what day of the week it is without my help," Richard stated with absolute, arrogant certainty. "The poor woman couldn't find her own car keys yesterday. The transition to the care facility will be seamless, Chloe. She won't even realize she's lost everything until the heavy doors lock permanently behind her." I sat absolutely motionless in the crowded corner booth of the downtown cafe, calmly sipping my lukewarm chamomile tea while watching my husband confidently detail my impending institutionalization. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I methodically tagged the video file with the exact time and date, uploading the damning footage immediately to Patricia's legal server. His arrogant words were precisely the irrefutable ammunition we needed for the absolute kill shot. The next critical step was tracing the money flowing smoothly into Aria Holdings. I discreetly reached out to Sarah Jenkins, a remarkably sharp mid-level bank manager at our primary financial institution who had known my late father well. Using the undeniable leverage of Patricia's fast-moving legal subpoena, Sarah quietly pulled the deeply buried transaction logs. The results were absolutely staggering. Over the last 14 months, Richard had successfully siphoned over $2.4 million from our supposedly untouchable joint investment, accounts directly into the untraceable offshore LLC. He had expertly forged my unique signature on over 17 separate, highly complex wire transfer authorization forms. Every single document Sarah uncovered was another heavy, undeniable nail driven directly into Richard's polished, impenetrable coffin. Before I tell you exactly how I dropped the massive legal hammer, I need to know if you are still with me. If you are still listening to my story, please leave a simple "still here" in the comments right now. Your quiet support means absolutely everything to a woman who was brutally silenced for over 3 decades. Before I could drop the massive legal hammer, I desperately needed to establish a rigid boundary escalation pattern, completely proving his aggressive coercion for the skeptical court. I needed him on official record, reacting violently to my incredibly reasonable requests. The confrontation began politely over a seemingly mundane Sunday breakfast. "Richard, I'd really like to accompany you to the massive regional developers gala this Friday," I said softly, carefully stirring sugar into my morning coffee while the hidden dictaphone rolled silently. He didn't even bother looking up from his financial newspaper. "Not this time, Alina. The overwhelming noise and flashing lights confuse you late at night. You're staying peacefully right here." His tone was infuriatingly dismissive, exactly as I had perfectly predicted. I escalated immediately to the second necessary stage, letting my voice grow noticeably firmer. "I need to be at that incredibly important table, Richard. Those are the very same city council members I worked closely alongside for over 20 years. He finally lowered the crisp newspaper, his dark eyes instantly flashing with barely concealed irritation. "And what exactly will you tell them, Alina? Will you tell them how you effortlessly lose your glasses every single day?" "I will absolutely not have you embarrassing my firm by asking the mayor the exact same question 3 times. It was a magnificent, perfectly delivered piece of calculated gaslighting, and the hidden digital recorder captured every single crystal-clear syllable of his malicious intent. My escalating boundary was effortlessly established. I pushed him sharply to the third and most dangerous stage, introducing a clear warning. "If you continually insist on aggressively isolating me from our shared life, Richard, I will have to seriously reconsider the fundamental arrangement of this entire marriage." A long, suffocating silence heavily filled the bright kitchen. He slowly folded the newspaper, heavily placing his large hands completely flat on the wooden table, leaning aggressively into my personal space. The condescension violently melted away, leaving only pure, terrifying hostility. "You cannot reconsider anything, Alina. You have absolutely no money, 0 credibility, and a rapidly failing mind. If you ever threaten me again, I will have the doctors declare you legally incompetent by Monday morning." The trap was now perfectly, beautifully set. That evening, I quietly finalized the absolute timeline with my deeply trusted allies. We had the comprehensive financial records, the undeniable video proof of his massive infidelity and corporate sabotage, the forged bank documents, and the crystal-clear audio threats. All the devastating evidence was safely locked behind impenetrable firewalls. But Patricia specifically warned me that we desperately needed one final, undeniable catalyst to absolutely guarantee an emergency injunction and permanent restraining order. We needed Richard to physically abandon me or put me in immediate, undeniable danger, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that he was actively abusing a vulnerable senior. The universe, in its twisted, deeply ironic way, delivered that exact brutal catalyst just 3 days later, arriving disguised as a romantic mountain getaway. "We're taking a quiet trip to the mountain cabin for our anniversary," Richard had loudly announced on Thursday morning, practically tossing a heavy duffel bag near the front door. "The crisp mountain air will do wonders for your increasingly frazzled nerves, Alina." I knew instantly that this was a thinly veiled setup. The remote cabin belonged strictly to my family's trust. My late father had built it decades ago. Driving me there in the middle of a brutal, fast-approaching northwest snowstorm made absolutely no logistical sense, unless his intention was deeply malicious. I rapidly texted David a single prearranged code word: "Avalanche." Within precisely 10 minutes, David successfully tapped into the GPS tracking module hidden deep inside Richard's luxury SUV. The long, winding drive up the steep mountain pass was completely suffused with a heavy, suffocating silence. The dark skies rapidly threatened sleet, and the dropping temperature aggressively frosted the pristine windows. When we finally pulled into the deeply overgrown, muddy dirt driveway, Richard left the heavy engine idling smoothly. He casually unlocked the central doors, but made zero move to actually exit the warm vehicle. "The cabin heater has been acting incredibly finicky," he stated coldly, staring directly at the thick tree line. "Go down and check the main basement breaker, Alina. Make absolutely sure the heavy pipes haven't frozen solid." I looked at him, my heart hammering violently against my frozen ribs. The nearest neighbor was over 14 miles away. I slowly stepped out of the warm SUV into the biting, brutal cold, the freezing mud instantly soaking through my thin shoes. I walked deliberately up the warped wooden steps, gripping the heavy iron cabin key in my trembling hand. As soon as I slid the old key smoothly into the rusty deadbolt, I vividly heard the heavy SUV crunch violently against the coarse gravel. I spun around just in time to watch Richard aggressively throw the vehicle into reverse, expertly spinning the large tires before tearing recklessly back down the treacherous mountain road without a single moment of hesitation. He didn't even pause to see if the door successfully opened. The 40-mile walk had officially begun. But I definitely wasn't walking 40 miles, and I certainly wasn't going to freeze to death on my father's old porch. I didn't even bother attempting to open the frozen cabin door. Instead, I calmly reached into my heavy wool coat and pressed the button on my backup phone. I casually walked down the steps and stood quietly by the sprawling oak tree. Less than 3 agonizing minutes later, the blinding high beams of a battered, heavily modified Ford truck cut aggressively through the rapidly darkening forest. The truck slid smoothly to a stop on the icy gravel. David pushed the heavy passenger door open, warm air violently blasting out into the freezing storm. "Did you successfully get the audio recording, Aunt Alina?" I climbed quickly into the blessedly heated cabin of the large truck, my trembling fingers instantly pulling the small dictaphone from my icy coat. "I absolutely got every single word, David. And Patricia successfully filed the injunction papers electronically the exact second his GPS crossed back over the county line." We drove carefully back into the bustling city as the powerful storm finally broke, dropping inches of heavy snow on the exact same road Richard assumed I was desperately walking on. He thought he had completely won the massive war by destroying his aging wife in the absolute middle of nowhere. He had no idea he had just confidently handed me the exact rope I deeply needed to publicly hang him. We didn't drive back to the sprawling Mercer Island estate. That massive house was still heavily wired with David's hidden cameras, but legally, it was about to become an active, massive crime scene. We arrived at a nondescript downtown hotel suite, precisely booked under David's corporate account. The room was fiercely functional, dominated by a large mahogany table completely overflowing with labeled financial binders and hard drives. Patricia Caldwell was already waiting patiently, her sharp reading glasses perched dangerously low on her hawkish nose. As I walked heavily through the door, shivering slightly from the remaining adrenaline, Patricia handed me heavily fortified coffee. Her severe expression barely softened as she expertly reviewed the digital files I handed over from my dictaphone. "You survived the freezing mountain trap completely flawlessly, Alina," she stated flatly, instantly plugging the USB backup drive into her heavily padded laptop. The three of us spent the next agonizing 4 hours meticulously cross-referencing every single piece of audio, video, and financial documentation. By 2 a.m, the complex, devastating web of Richard's criminal enterprise lay fully exposed on the wooden table. He hadn't just severely abused my trust. He had systematically embezzled over $7 million from the private accounts of vulnerable, elderly retirees whose estates he ostensibly managed. Arya Holdings wasn't just his lavish personal slush fund. It was the exact offshore vehicle he used to relentlessly launder the stolen capital before permanently moving it into Chloe's shell companies. We didn't just have enough bulletproof evidence to stop an illegal conservatorship. We had enough raw, uncompromising data to utterly destroy his entire professional world and send him aggressively into a federal penitentiary for the next decade. At exactly 6 a.m, Patricia's heavily encrypted phone vibrated sharply on the cluttered desk. She reviewed the terse text message and smiled, a predatory, terrifying expression completely devoid of mercy. "Richard's high-priced lawyers have officially filed an emergency request for a temporary medical conservatorship with Judge Harrison," Patricia announced, her voice incredibly smooth and lethal. "They are aggressively claiming that you wandered off into the freezing forest during a severe mentally unstable episode, and that Richard frantically searched the woods for hours before desperately calling his legal team." My cold hands finally stopped shaking completely. He had eagerly walked right into our trap, confidently believing I was either dead from exposure or hopelessly lost in the unforgiving mountains. What he didn't realize was that I was sitting aggressively in complete comfort, reviewing his corporate execution. "Make absolutely sure you stick around for this exact confrontation. What happened next in an open courtroom will completely change the way you look at narcissistic control forever. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss these kinds of incredibly satisfying, undeniable reversals of absolute power." By 2 p.m, I walked purposefully into courtroom 4 wearing a pristine navy blue power suit I had quietly purchased 3 weeks prior. It didn't just look flawlessly professional. It felt like invincible medieval armor. David confidently carried a heavy locked briefcase overflowing with massive digital hard drives, while Patricia rolled 2 towering boxes of certified financial documents directly behind us. We expertly bypassed the stunned security detail and marched directly into the tense courtroom. Richard sat rigidly beside his incredibly expensive defense attorney, flawlessly playing the role of the distraught, grieving husband. When his dark, arrogant eyes finally locked onto mine, his carefully polished face instantly cracked. Complete, paralyzing shock violently contorted his features as he genuinely struggled to comprehend exactly how I was standing there perfectly alive and fiercely completely composed. "All rise," the board bailiff called aggressively over the low murmurs, formally initiating the swift cascade of consequences. "Your Honor," Richard's attorney started smoothly, barely recovering from his immense strategic panic. "My client is devastated by his wife's tragic cognitive collapse in the winter mountains." Patricia stepped forward like a shark smelling raw blood in the dark water. "Please sit down, counselor," Patricia ordered aggressively, turning squarely to the stunned judge. "We are heavily contesting this entirely fraudulent conservatorship," Patricia stated, effortlessly dropping a 5-pound binder of evidence directly onto her table. "Are you seriously claiming my deeply grieving client is lying?" His attorney sputtered furiously, clearly losing complete control of his fabricated narrative. Richard's face drained entirely of blood as he stared wildly between the towering binders and my perfectly calm, unreadable expression. I am aggressively claiming your deeply corrupt client attempted to freeze his loyal wife to death. Patricia fired back flawlessly, practically paralyzing the entire courtroom with the immense weight of the massive accusation. This is an absolute, deeply outrageous slander. Richard violently shouted, completely unable to stop himself as his arrogant mask horribly fractured. If it is truly slander, Richard, then kindly explain exactly why you rapidly transferred $45,000 to an offshore LLC called Aria Holdings yesterday. I practically whispered the devastating, calculated sentence across the quiet, frozen room, but it echoed loudly like a heavy steel hammer striking an anvil. The absolute silence that immediately followed was profound. The meticulously calculated witness cascade completely demolished his pitiful defense within 20 minutes of the rapid exchange. Patricia confidently called Sarah Jenkins to the heavily fortified stand, presenting an entire folder of heavily forged wire transfer documents. Sarah aggressively reviewed the documents, her sharp voice never wavering once as she legally confirmed the multiple counterfeit signatures and highly questionable secondary approvals on the corporate accounts. I have professionally managed immense wealth for 15 years, Your Honor, Sarah confidently testified, looking directly at the rapidly panicking defense table. This is without a doubt the most blatant, aggressive case of targeted elder financial abuse and corporate embezzlement I have ever witnessed in my entire career. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deeply organized theft. David stepped up onto the stand next, expertly explaining the massive cache of hidden video and pristine audio files we had successfully intercepted over the last crucial month. When Patricia carefully played the incredibly clear, high-definition MP3 recording of Richard maliciously mocking my intelligence to his young mistress, the entire gallery collectively gasped out loud. Once the doctors officially sign off on Aliner's rapid cognitive decline, the conservatorship kicks in completely. His arrogant voice boomed loudly through the court's pristine speakers, completely exposing the terrifying depths of his chilling malice. The judge's eyes narrowed dangerously, a terrifying, icy glare locked exclusively on Richard's shrinking figure. The magnificent illusion of the powerful, deeply devoted patriarch had completely evaporated, effortlessly replaced by the horrifying truth of a financially desperate sociopath aggressively scrambling for survival. But the absolute, final, undeniable blow came from an entirely unexpected direction. During David's extensive technical investigation, he had expertly dug deep into Richard's heavily encrypted private communications. It turned out Richard hadn't just brutally manipulated his own wife. He had effectively blackmailed my struggling sister Helen, aggressively paying off her massive, hidden gambling debts in direct exchange for her false testimony regarding my supposed rapid mental decline. When Patricia successfully introduced Helen's heavily redacted emails confirming the massive, illicit payoff, the enormous courtroom erupted violently into absolute chaos. Richard desperately buried his face completely in his shaking hands. The brilliant trap he had so incredibly painstakingly built to permanently cage my failing mind had violently snapped perfectly shut right on his own neck. Just as the completely overwhelmed judge was formally moving to forcefully dismiss the entire fraudulent conservatorship petition, the heavy wooden doors at the absolute back of the crowded courtroom violently slammed open. 3 stern, heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation aggressively marched directly down the quiet center aisle, aggressively flashing massive steel badges. The immaculate timing of their arrival was heavily deliberate, a flawless piece of incredible legal theater flawlessly orchestrated entirely by Patricia's connections. They were holding massive federal warrants for aggressive wire fraud, extreme elder financial abuse, and deeply organized corporate embezzlement. The massive, lucrative real estate empire Richard had ruthlessly worshipped for decades was utterly collapsing around him in absolute real time. I quietly watched his rapid downfall without an ounce of pity. 6 agonizing months following the massive, explosive civil hearing, we gathered together quietly again in a far larger federal courtroom for Richard's massive criminal sentencing phase. He had hopelessly tried to spin an incredibly laughable story, insisting he was somehow being aggressively persecuted, claiming that the heavily documented embezzlement was simply a massive misunderstanding of incredibly complex accounting principles. But under Patricia's flawless, utterly devastating cross-examination, his frantic lies completely, spectacularly unraveled in front of the silent, heavily observant jury. The final verdict was unbelievably swift and totally brutal, unequivocally guilty on every single felony count. He brutally lost his entire massive commercial fortune, his extremely lucrative license, and every single shred of his meticulously curated professional reputation. The incredibly stern federal judge aggressively stared down at Richard's heavily shaking, slightly hunched shoulders, her deeply booming voice completely loaded with total finality. "Mr. Vance, you aggressively targeted incredibly vulnerable investors, heavily corrupted corporate systems, and absolutely attempted to maliciously institute a completely fraudulent medical conservatorship to rob your own loyal wife of her entire life savings. This federal court sentences you aggressively to 96 months in federal prison without any remote possibility of early release or simple parole. 8 full, agonizing years locked permanently behind heavy steel bars. When the heavy marshals violently cuffed his wrists behind his custom-tailored suit, Richard turned his deeply broken, bloodshot eyes toward me. He furiously mouthed a silent, empty threat. I slowly stood up, my posture incredibly straight and flawlessly unapologetic, my voice remarkably calm but loaded with pure steel. "Your lesson completely failed, Richard," I firmly whispered, ensuring the crisp words flawlessly cut aggressively through the noisy courtroom exactly like sharp glass. "But the resulting civil suits actively start completely next month." The entire massive courtroom fell completely silent, absolutely captivated by the total reversal of absolute power. For the very first time in more than 30 agonizing years, I was no longer the desperately anxious, completely silenced, and horribly managed little wife. I aggressively walked gracefully out of the federal building and directly into the incredibly bright Seattle sunlight. His aggressive attempt to totally erase me had instead fully restored my entire original power. With his massive, ill-gotten fortune completely clawed back through our fierce legal battles, I finally faced an incredibly important choice. I could quietly completely fade into an easy, obscure retirement, or I could aggressively transform the horrible pain he heavily caused into something incredibly monumental. I chose the latter without any hesitation. Using his massive seized assets, I successfully founded the Watchful Auditor Foundation, a deeply aggressive non-profit agency entirely dedicated to heavily fighting complex elder financial exploitation and abusive corporate guardianships. David expertly leads our massive technical security division, whilst Patricia effortlessly runs the fierce legal defense clinic. We aggressively teach incredibly vulnerable, older women how to legally protect themselves. My absolute final revenge wasn't simply merely surviving his awful trap. It was turning his entire destructive fortune into an absolute unstoppable shield strictly for those he fundamentally despised. Exactly 3 years after the massive federal trial forcefully concluded, a remarkably thick, battered envelope arrived quietly in my new Seattle mailbox. The handwriting was incredibly unmistakable, perfectly slanted and violently pressed deep into the cheap, lined prison stationery. It was exactly 4 pages of pure, isolated, unadulterated bitterness from Richard, detailing his miserable existence behind heavy steel bars. He falsely blamed me entirely for his massive professional downfall, aggressively claiming I had ruthlessly set him up from the very beginning to completely steal his hard-earned, lucrative real estate empire. He refused to admit any accountability for the stolen retiree funds or the forged quitclaim deeds. Instead, he ended the rambling, deeply delusional manifesto with a single, incredibly arrogant line positioned sharply at the very bottom. "I truly hope you finally learned your devastating lesson, Aliner." I read his incredibly toxic letter exactly once, sitting peacefully at my brand new quartz kitchen island, while the bright morning sunlight filtered heavily through the expansive glass windows. I didn't feel a single ounce of residual anger, suffocating fear, or even incredibly simple regret. Instead, I quietly folded the heavy, lined pages, walked calmly and directly into my small, quiet home office, and securely slipped the entire delusional letter straight through the loud mechanical paper shredder. I aggressively walked back into the bright kitchen, poured myself a steaming, incredibly fragrant cup of fresh chamomile tea with a thick, sour slice of lemon, and peacefully watched the joyful neighborhood kids ride their colorful bicycles down the incredibly safe, deeply quiet street. The warm tea tasted like absolute, undeniable freedom. The profound, liberating truth is, I absolutely did learn my devastating, life-altering lesson during those suffocating 34 years. I vividly learned that profound, deeply hidden cruelty always hopelessly exposes itself if you simply have the extreme, absolute patience to quietly collect the undeniable evidentiary trail. Above all, I deeply learned that true, deeply rooted strength is rarely incredibly loud, visibly explosive, or dramatically violent in its execution. It is perfectly steady, entirely strategic, and completely, undeniably unstoppable in the long run. Richard genuinely thought he had confidently left me completely broken, utterly frozen, and hopelessly trapped in a brutal winter storm on a deserted, terrifying mountain road. But all he really did that awful night was forcefully hand me the absolute master key to walk straight out of his golden prison, securely lock the heavy steel door eternally behind him, and completely refuse to ever look back.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.